System Design Interview Volume 2. At the time of recording, this book is the #1 bestseller on Amazon US for computer science books. This book was published by my friend Alex Su, and this video is my review of this book. Hey, this is Garrett with the Pragmatic Engineer talking about software engineering, engineering management, and big tech and startups. If you like these videos but would like more content, subscribe to my newsletter at pragmaticengineer.com. It's the most read newsletter for engineering managers and software engineers, and it's the #1 technology newsletter on Substack. It's free to sign up, and there's a paid version with much more content. If you're getting the paid version, there's a good chance you can expense it just like a lot of subscribers do for their learning and education development budget. So now let's talk about the book, but before we do, let me tell you how I met the book's author, Alex. Back about 1.5 years, 2 years ago, I was researching resources to prepare for system design interviews, and I bought this book called System Design Interview: An Insider's Guide off Amazon. I read the book and it was pretty good. It covered basics like rate limiting, consistent hashing, and sharding. Now, I wish it went into a bit more details on topics like caching or replication strategies, but in all fairness, if you want to learn about deep topics related to backend engineering, reliability, and scalability, the Designing Data Applications books is the one book to go. And this is a really, really heavy read. It's also just a lot more content than the original system design book. I mean, you can see the difference between these two books. We're talking about 600 pages versus 300, but smaller pages. So after reading the book, I reached out to the author because I was also writing a book and I just wanted to hear from him, and I actually liked the book that he wrote. We did a video call and I learned that Alex had been a full-time writer writing this book for about 2 years after he quit his job at Twitter, and beforehand he worked at Apple and Zynga as software engineer. And he was telling me that he was writing a second book and it'll probably take him about 1 year to finish. Well, he was wrong because it didn't take him 1 year, it took him 1.5 years, and this is his second book. So what I liked about both of these books is it's been written by someone who has actually done the job. This was a senior software engineer working at large tech companies like Twitter, like Apple, who has actually done a lot of these interviews themselves. And this might not seem like a big deal, but these days it seems there's a whole industry for interview preparation where anyone who worked 1 year at any given company will give you advice on how to prepare for advanced interviews. Now, for system design interviews, these are interviews that are typically expected at senior level, staff level interviews. And if you have 1 year of experience, I mean, you can give advice, but it might not be really accurate, especially if you've never done the interview, you've not sat on the debriefs, and you've also not successfully passed interviews at these levels. So how do these two books compare? Well, first of all, the second book is just a lot thicker, also a lot bigger. It's basically a lot more content. The first book is about 300 pages. This book is about 400 pages. Now, the interesting thing is that in terms of chapters, the first book has more chapters. It has 16 different chapters. Each chapter is basically a case study. And this second book, it has 13 chapters. And these are proximity service, nearby friends, Google Maps, distributed message queue, metrics monitoring, ad click events, hotel reservation, distributed email service, S3 service, real-time gaming leaderboard, payment system, digital wallet, and stock exchange. Now also, while the first book was written by only Alex himself, the second one has 2 authors on them. The second author is Sam Lam. And I asked Alex, and he told me that Sam was his old colleague working at Zynga, a very knowledgeable, very experienced engineer, and the two of them wrote the chapters together. Alex told me that typically he would write the first version, and then Sam would go through and sometimes completely rewrite what was written as well, so they definitely put double the firepower behind the second book. Also, Volume 2 has a lot of reviewers, and I know this because Alex reached out to me to review the payments chapter, which I did do some review on it, but each chapter has been thoroughly reviewed by experienced software engineers, staff software engineering, directors of engineering, working at well-known companies. The structure of each chapter has not changed in the second book as it has been in the first book. It's a very simple setup. There's 4 parts to each chapter. First, it's about understanding the problem and setting up the scope. I like to phrase this as confirming the problem, asking questions, and making constraints clear. This will be your introductory conversation, and in a system design interview, spitting out a problem early will get you no bonus points at all. You want to make sure you're solving the right problem. Next one is proposing a high-level solution and getting some buy-in from the interviewer. I see people sometimes just jumping really quickly into implementing the solutions, but not talking with the interviewer, not confirming that this is what they're looking for, and those interviews don't end well typically. The interviewers at this point expect a conversation just like in real life when you have to build a system. You confirm the constraints, get a bit of back and forth, and then you get to a high-level design that both you and the interviewer are kind of happy with. Then there's a deep dive. Once you have the high-level design, either you or the interviewer will choose an area and you're going to go deep into there. This is where domain knowledge, the vocabulary of the problems, and your real-life experience starts to matter and show. Now, these books do list out a lot of topics that you'll need to know to talk about these specific concepts, and especially the vocabulary. But you might need to prepare from resources like the System Design Primer or even from designing data-intensive applications. And you also might need to know specific details of technology that you're proposing to use, which you can do mostly by experience or reading a lot of case studies. Finally, once you've gone through the deep dive or multiple deep dives, you're going to wrap up and you're going to point out real-world improvement areas that you don't have time to do in this interview, but you would do it if this was a real problem. These typically have to do with productionization, looking at future bottlenecks as the service grows in certain areas. The goal of this one is just to make it clear to your interviewer that you know you're not finished. In fact, designing a system is never finished. Even after you ship, you maintain, you improve, and you extend. So let's dive into one specific chapter, the payments chapter. Before we do, if you're preparing for interviews and you're a senior engineer or an engineering manager, I have this cool side project where I send some emails when I have time on advice on how to prepare for interviews. I share some of my interview experiences. It's completely free. Sign up on the link below. One warning, it is free, but I do this whenever I have free time, and usually I prioritize my newsletter before I get to this email list. But when you sign up, you get all the previous interview preparation advice in your inbox as well. So now let's zoom through chapter 11, building a payment system. I'm really just quickly going to zoom through to give you a sense on what the book is like, and also let's talk a little bit about payments because I like talking about payments. I've been working on this area for 4 years when I was at Uber. If you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so you get notified of follow-up videos as well. So step 1 is understanding the problem, and if you're told to build a payment system, you need to clarify a bunch of stuff with your interviewer. Now keep in mind that this book is trying to kind of simulate a realistic interview of what kind of back and forth you might be doing with the interviewer, but it's just that, it's simulation. In the real world, it's a lot more important that you have that dynamic conversation, and there is nothing really to memorize here beyond some of the concepts that you'll need to know what they mean. So this book gives an example conversation that could be the real world. So for example, as a candidate, you're going to ask like, what kind of system are we building? You know, is it Amazon? Is it Netflix? And, you know, the interviewer might say that we're doing something like e-commerce, like Amazon.com. Next question that you definitely need to know for payments is what kind of payment options do we do? Are we going to do credit cards? Are we going to do wallets? Are we going to do cash? That kind of stuff. And the interviewer will probably say that we're looking for stuff that is similar to real life. Now, an important question for payments is, do we handle credit card processing ourselves? And if the interviewer says, yes, we are doing it and you need to design for this, you're probably interviewing at Visa or somewhere. Credit card processing is one of the most difficult problems to solve just because there's so many regulations and a lot of stuff to do. How do I know this? The team next to me at Uber actually implemented a system kind of like this, and it was a very, very long and painful process. Then we should figure out if we store credit card data in our system. Again, it complicates things massively because there's a lot of regulatory things around this, which again, in an interview you might not know. So typically interviewers will keep this out of scope. Again, unless you're interviewing for some really specific role, but that is not software engineering, that is payments engineering. You'll want to ask about the global requirements. Is it just for a certain locale or not? How many transactions are we expecting? So the load, how many users? Those are always good questions to ask. And what kind of flows we need to support? Is it payout? Is it pay-in? And this specific question is more specific to payments. So again, you'll want to think of the domain. And what the book does, it brings you these 13 different examples and it gives you a bunch of questions, but on the spot, you might be asking different questions as well. As I mentioned, I've been building payment systems at Uber for 4 years, so I'm very familiar with this domain. And you know, these questions do a pretty good job for a generic candidate who knows, like if a candidate asked me all these questions, I would say they actually know their payments pretty well. If you are building a proper real world payment systems and you had the time to design, there's a lot of other questions that you would ask. These includes what are SLAs that we need to optimize for? What kind of latencies are acceptable or not acceptable in the different flows? For example, the credit card processing flows. Do we have some flows that are blocking customers to proceed? For example, do we need to worry about authorization on credit cards? What about fraud? Is this in scope or out of scope? And in the real world, it would be in scope. You cannot just leave fraud to linger around like that. What about reconciliation flows? What about chargebacks? And there's a lot of other details that in a real payment system you need to address. But this list actually did a pretty good job going through a lot of the concepts that you would want to ask for payments. So on step 2, we're going to do a high-level proposal of the design of the system. And this is where it starts to be a bit of a conversation with the interviewer. So you do draw something up saying, here's what I'm thinking, and then you go, what do you think? And you're going to go back and forth. So in this case, the book just draws a really simple thing where we have the buyers, we have the website, we have the sellers, and we have a pay-in and a payout scope to worry about. And in the high-level diagram, this candidate draws up a pretty simple system that consists of a payment service, a ledger, a wallet, a payment executor, and they're saying, all right, so we're going to get payment events that go into the payment service, which we're going to save those payment events into some sort of database. Then we're going to talk with our payment service provider, but we're going to talk not directly with them, but we have a layer where we save all the communication, and we're going to talk with service providers like Stripe, Adyen, MasterCard, Apple Pay, Google Pay. I could go on all about this because my team at Uber, we owned this part and we integrated with about 15 different payment service providers. So I've seen it all, or most of it at least. And then when the response comes back, we then update our wallet with the credits and the debits, and we also record things to the ledger. And this is a high level design. And by the way, if someone drew up a design like this for me from scratch, I would know that either they read this book or they built a payment system, because all of this is pretty accurate, and this is how most payment systems, including how Uber's payment system was built. And concepts like a ledger is pretty important in payments, and the book goes into more detail. I'm not going to cover that part. And also the concept of the wallet and how it's different to a ledger, that is also not as trivial, and it is a logical implementation of how most payment systems go about this. This high-level design then talks through all of these different concepts, what they mean. It actually proposes some APIs. It goes through a data model for the payment service and for the ledger. It actually tells you, it educates you on the double entry ledger system, which was one of the first things that I learned at Uber when we started to work on payment systems. And it's an interesting one because it's not a complicated concept, but if you didn't learn economics or didn't have finance classes, it's just something to just quickly learn. As a quick one, if you're an experienced software engineer or engineering manager looking for a job, I run a job board for these positions, and these are places where I only list companies which have really good engineering cultures, which means they score at least 10 out of 12 on the pragmatic engineer test, which is a test I built to get a sense of engineering culture signals that are not always in the job advert. A lot of the jobs have salary ranges, a lot of them support remote work as well. Here's a couple of featured jobs, and you can view all of them on this job page. I regularly add new and vetted jobs. And also, if you're a hiring manager who's hiring, consider posting to this job, which does have pretty good response rates, and companies are happy with how much they can hire engineers with the help of this one. Go to pragmaticengineer.com and click on the job board to access it, or check it out on the link below. So now, after the high-level overview comes the design deep dive, and this is typically the bulk of the system design interview if you've done the high-level setup in a pretty good way. Now, this is areas where you and the interviewer will agree on what areas to dive into. And in the case of a payment system, oh man, there's a lot of areas you can dive into, from how the PSP integrations work to how you reconcile things, PSP delays and processing delays, communication. Failed payments is a fantastic topic and source of so many outages. Exactly one's delivery, which was a huge problem that we looked at Uber and we solved. It's one of these really interesting and challenging problems. I would expect that at SAP levels, exact one delivery would be a topic. Consistency on what kind of consistency models are important, payment security. So the cool thing about this book is that in every chapter, it does go into these specific areas. And I'm going to skip through PSP integration because I could just talk about this like a lot. Again, this is what my team did at Uber for a very long time, and what I did as well. So yeah, let's jump into the reconciliation section. And I'm actually pleasantly surprised that reconciliation was included as a deep dive part of the book, because honestly, this was one of the areas where my team lost a bit of money on one of the outages, which was 6 months into when I was at Uber, and that's how I learned about reconciliation. Had I seen this chapter beforehand, I might have been a little bit wiser. So what is reconciliation? So as the book also describes, it's how when you talk with the payment service providers and you say, charge this and this amount of money, that money is not really in your account. It will be in your account once you reconcile, probably at the end of the day, end of the week, or sometimes end of the month, when the payment service providers, they send you a settlement file, which is typically some old school format. I mean, some old school providers do Excel spreadsheets, but most of the time it's something that you get through SFTP or even FTP channels. And then you look at that file and you see for each row that this file has, you make sure, is it in the ledger? Yes. This one is missing. You look at both sides. You look at your ledger where you have all of the entries, and you look at their entries. And surprise, surprise, a lot of the time these are not the same. And then you have a reconciliation issue. You need to figure out whose problem this was. And this is where the database of storing all of the API requests that you make and the responses become really important, because now you have a source of truth to figure out, the reconciliation service will typically talk to this database as well. It'll look like the ledger, and it'll look at the settlement file. The details of reconciliation are really to do with what details are inside of this file, what the format is, and what is stored at your ledger. Now, to go deeper and design a system, we cannot do it without looking at the specifics, so this will be out of scope for system design interviews. But as someone who's done some of these reconciliation challenges, I'll tell you that the common challenges include refunds, chargebacks, or accounts deleted after the charges happen, but they might not exist anymore. But I was really pleasantly surprised that there was a reconciliation section in the book as well. And then there's the other deep dives that the book goes through, and I'm just going to scroll through them. I'm not going to really stop, except for failed payments, which again was something that at Uber we had to worry about all the time. And this was something that we did have our retry queue. We had our dead letter queue for stuff that was not retryable. There are some implementation details that the book doesn't really talk about. For example, retry strategies. What kind of backoff strategy do you do? Do you do linear backoff or exponential backoff? Also, there's a special payments term called dunning. When you are retrying payments at bulk, you just run a dunning job, and this just hits all the different credit cards or payment instruments that you have on file. And if you don't do this well, this can actually cause a real load at your system at scale. In fact, I got a reach out after I left Uber about a startup that was only doing basically dunning as a service. So, there you have it. Anyway, this is details that is very, very domain specific. So there is a reason that this book doesn't cover it. And then the book goes through interesting areas like exactly once delivery, how you implement that, item potency, consistency, and so on. Finally, the book closes with a wrap-up of what other topics you could talk about that you clearly will not have time in a 60-minute interview. And these do include all the production-ready things. For example, monitoring, alerting, debugging tools, currency exchange, geography, cash payment, Google Apple integration, and all of these topics are just really big topics by themselves. You could easily write like 50 pages of each of these topics. And I'll give you an example, cash payments. The cash team at Uber was sitting next to me. When I joined in 2016, there was 1.5 engineers, and that team was processing $1 billion per year with 1.5 engineers. It was a running joke of the company that we can't afford to hire engineers because that team just never got headcount. But oh wow, cash payments has so much complexity that you wouldn't realize until you work at a company that does millions of cash payments per day. At some point, about 40% of Uber's payments, like the number of transactions, were cash payments. There's also some challenges, from fraud challenges to physical safety challenges, which include of what happens if the driver does not have change to return and there's a customer who's pretty upset. This could get physical, for example. So we actually had to build solutions for that, not just theoretical stuff that we just ship to users, but this was really, really real world challenges. How do you get the commission from cash heavy drivers who now owe you money and they would have to drive into some office to give you the cash? There's host of really, really interesting challenges that I saw at Uber. My team was not working on the cash team, but again, they were sitting next to us and they were doing it. And then what I really like about this book is at the end of each chapter, there's a chapter summary where there's this mind map that Alex put in place, which goes through each steps of functional, non-functional. It's just a nice reminder of how the book is built up. It also gives you a bit of a reminder, and it might help you think in these terms, in these logical steps, because if you ask me, there's 3 parts to do a good systems design interview. First, you want to talk with the interviewer back and forth. Second, you need to have some past experience or domain knowledge, because otherwise you can't really make a lot of this stuff up. But third, you need to be structured. You need to go step by step, start with the high level, then do a deep dive, be really good at being able to go deep and go back out and carry on from where you were. And this honestly comes with practice, either on the job or practicing some of these interviews, ideally a mix of both. Now, the book also has tons of references, and this is not just there for show. If you're actually preparing for these interviews, you probably want to jump into and read some of these articles, which are usually high quality ones. Overall, what I found is this chapter is a pretty good representation of the whole book. I'm someone who happened to work on these payment systems, so I know this area really well inside out. And from this perspective, this chapter could have gone into a lot more payment-specific domain details. So for example, it could have talked about dunning, it could have talked about payments fraud, but if it did, it would have not fit into the 30 pages that it is. And as I was reading the rest of the book, all of these chapters felt pretty big as well. So I feel that the authors, Alex and his co-author, did a good job balancing on making this book super, super long and just not really enjoyable to read, versus trying to focus on the most important things that are maybe not as domain specific, for example, payment specific, but they're more software engineering specific. So this payments chapter did touch on consistency, on idempotency, on retries, and a lot of the things that are not just useful for payments, but for engineering any kind of system. So my overall take is this book is good. It's well written, it's well researched, it balances conciseness and details. And yes, there will be always some missing details in some of the areas, which either you're going to have to research, or if you're going to work on one of these topics, you're going to learn. I could have really benefited reading the payments chapter before I started at Uber, because I learned most of those concepts in the first 6 or actually 12 months even. So it would have gotten me ahead in that sense. Right now, I really don't know any better books to prepare for systems design interviews than this second edition, well, together with the first edition, because they cover different topics. My suggestion though is, if you buy this book, don't just read through page by page, but instead pause at the beginning of the chapters, do a little bit of research on the domain, draw up stuff that you think would be a good design. And as you go through the book suggestions, digest them, draw them in. Instead of just being a passive consumer where you're going to forget a lot of these things, be active and look up the references and make sure that you understand how these things can make sense. And most importantly, don't use this book as like, oh, I'm going to go through all these 13 different exercises, and if someone asks something, I can just draw the whole thing up on the wall. This is more about understanding that it's always about trade-offs. It's always about use cases, and there's different ways that you can solve these use cases. And once you have that toolbox, you can then use which approach is appropriate for the given problem that you're going to be talking through with the interviewer. That's it for my book review. I definitely recommend this book, well, actually both books. The link is below if you want to buy them. And if you're interested in another great engineering book recommendation, check out my video on the philosophy of software design, which is one of my favorite books on software architecture. Thanks, and see you in the next one.